Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, Matt Carmichael, editor of Ipsos's What the Future magazine. Matt, over to you, please.
Thanks, Ellen, and greetings, everyone. For those of you who have been with us all day, I hope you've been enjoying all of the great information and fantastic speakers we've had. And for those of you just joining us for this session, welcome to the Ipsos Automotive Summit. This is the What the Future, or WTF, portion of the show. My name is Matt Carmichael. I am the editor of What the Future. WTF is a quarterly publication of Ipsos in normal times, and now, since the future is so much on everyone's mind, we're doing these every 2 weeks. We are focusing sector by sector at the moment. Recently we did an issue on the financial services, and obviously today is all about transportation and mobility. Each issue of WTF features both our own Ipsos expert opinions, as well as we bring in lots of voices and lots of different perspectives. So we're looking at the future of transportation. We have a futurist, we have car people, we have consultants, we have authors, we have behavioral scientists, we have urban planners. We are looking at this from a whole lot of different angles because we know that the future of transportation isn't just about transportation. It's all baked into our lifestyles. And what we have found in our data is that our lifestyles are changing. If you take something as so baked into most people's everyday lives as their commute, the fact that 30% of full-time employed Americans think that their commute is going to change because of COVID. Half of those people expect to drive to work more often, but another 30% expect to commute less overall. These are really big numbers that will change kind of the fundamental fabric of the way we move and the way we get from place to place and the way we interact with our home life spaces and our work life spaces. And one of the things that we like to think about when we're thinking about these future things is how different events like COVID-19 are going to change the long-standing and existing trends. So in 2017, we asked, do you consider yourself a car person? It's a pretty fundamental thing with the American culture, the idea of us being a car culture. And at that point, 60% of the people said, yeah, I think I'm somebody who's a car person. I think I'm passionate about the vehicles and the way I drive. And when we asked that just a couple weeks ago, that had dropped to just 50%. You know, we asked again, kind of a different way to look at that is, do you think that the car that you drive reflects your personality and reflects who you are and yourself? And the number of people who said it reflects them a great deal has decreased a little bit, and a similar number, it says, have increased it does not reflect them a great deal. So again, these are kind of big cultural trends that have been building for a long time. And what's going to be interesting as we move forward is to see if they accelerate, if they reverse, if they continue, if they pivot and weave a little bit. And we know these things are changing. 70% of the people are driving their vehicles less now than they were before this all started, which makes sense. People aren't commuting as much. People aren't running errands, driving their kids to school. But as they move forward out of this, about 25% think they're going to drive less than they did before. But 14% think they're going to drive more. So that leads us to kind of our central question of this discussion today, which is not if, but how will our driving behaviors change? And to kick this off, we're going to have kind of a little virtual fireside chat. Dr. Bahis Alan is the senior trend strategist from Intel, where she provides futuristic perspectives and opinions on trends and their impact on the brand landscape. And apparently she was also a hockey player, which I will admit I did not know until I was creeping on her LinkedIn profile earlier today. She is joined by Oscar Yuan, who's kind of the overall moderator of the WTF franchise, and he's the president of Ipsos Strategy 3, where he leads a global consultancy dedicated to combining consumer insights with marketing and business strategy. And I know a deep secret about one of his early jobs, which I don't know if he will share. But I will kick it off to them. They're going to talk a little bit about the changing role of cars in our lives. And I will leave it up to you. You have the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. And I'll perhaps share my first job. I grew up in Orange County, California, which you can have a think about what's down in Orange County, California, and we can talk about that maybe at the end of this call. But let's start, Bahis, about give me your sense on what's going to happen in the car market, right? I think the question Matt asked was how will our behaviors change? And I think right now the data we're seeing is a bit all over the place, right? Some people say, oh, I'm going to drive less, I'm going to be working from home more. On the other hand, we're seeing people saying, well, my car is my safe haven, right? It's clean, it protects me, I'm not going to take public transportation anymore. On the one hand, people are saying, we're going into a recession and I need to save money, I'm not going to buy a new car. On the other hand, we see that Hertz filing for bankruptcy puts 500,000 used vehicles on the market that's going to completely change pricing, right? So we're seeing a lot of these tensions in the car automotive space. Give me your sense on where you think things are headed, right? Are we going to drive more? Are we going to drive less? Are people going to buy cars? Are people not going to buy cars? And we can double click into some of those things.
Thank you so much.
Oh.
Yes, I'm exposed. I used to be the captain of the ice hockey team in Turkey, women's ice hockey team. So I love hockey still. Blackhawks, Chicago. It's very great question. Thank you so much, Oscar. Thanks for my Ipsos team for inviting me here. I have been collaborating on several discussions, and I learn more each time I meet with you guys. So I like using concepts to answer some questions, to understand some dynamics. From the start of this pandemic, everybody was asking, how did the consumer behavior, how did the consumer culture change, and which of these behavior will persist and be permanent as a result? So I find a couple of concepts very important. Routines, habits, and rituals are important consumer concepts to understand the permanence and persistence of behavior beyond COVID. Why? Because these behaviors, these different types of behaviors have different resiliences. Habits or routines are easier to build, easier to dissolve. On the other side, rituals are more difficult to build and more difficult to resolve. They're more resilient. Everybody talks about unprecedented as the keyword. For me, the keyword is resilience. So these concepts have different resiliences in the face of change. Routines are about how we navigate through change, right? Routines are behaviors that we do to navigate through change. Rather, the habits are automated decisions that we make so that we can make multiple decisions. Rituals are more symbolic, more communal. So when we look at how car behavior, it's a habit for you to commute to work, maybe through public transportation. You might keep that habit, but you might have a different routine around it, right? You do it in different ways. We can give examples from other categories. The Starbucks, you might have a habit of drinking coffee every morning, but now you're drinking it at home. You have a different routine about it. So the habits might stay the same, but the routines might change, or vice versa. So it's very important to understand how these change as a result of COVID, and what are the routines changing in terms of car behavior, car driving behavior, using public transportation, and how our habits are changing, how our rituals are changing. Not only about car, what we do with the car, right? We remember Christensen about the hiring milkshake for a job. So that was also related to our car consumption. So how is it changing other categories that we do around the car, about the car, or inside the car? So that's also very important. And I very much agree with Matt that human behavior is very difficult to change, right? These are cultural, concepts. So as we go through COVID, these changes produce some frictions. One of those frictions is inside and outside, as I identified. So everything inside we deem safe, clean, and everything outside is not so safe, not so private, not so clean. So you can do it. Inside of home is clean, outside not so much. Inside of fridge clean, outside not so much. Inside our city clean, outside not so much. Inside our nation it's cleaner, outside is not safe much. So this inside-outside friction is important because car has become an extension of home as a safe space and become the safe space for us where we can navigate this inside and outside. I was listening to the previous presentation. I really like this, going out without getting out. Exactly how balconies work at this point, going out without getting out. So car has become this new space, new place. It was a space, new place that has a new meaning of socialization and being outside. So that's very important. Similarly, the curbside pickup, right, that navigated new place interacts with this curbside, another new place for us in our lives, right? Curbsides have become a market transaction places, and we interact, car and this curbside interact. These new places interact. Car has become this new place of safety for us where we can socialize. Shall I go on?
What I'm hearing, So what I'm hearing, Behis, is you're saying that people are going to use their cars even more going forward. Is that right? Than before?
Yes. Yes.
And how does that?
The excess economy.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Maybe the excess economy has changed our perception of owning a car, right? Or the attitude towards owning a car. So yes, we will own more cars and we will use it in different. Car will be not only transportation, it will be a space. But this has started earlier. IKEA has a survey on the changing meanings of home. And there they say many people, home became a contaminated place because we rent our homes, we live with roommates, we date from home through mobile. So people go to their cars to find alone time, to find the meanings of home. That car turning into an extension, a network of space that carries the meaning of home has started before COVID.
Sure.
So it will,
so you're saying,
it will perpetuate.
Yeah, so you're saying people are going to spend more time in their cars, they're going to spend more on their cars because an extension of the home, it's a safe, clean space, right? What about what type of car, right? So I know pre-COVID there was a huge shift towards electrification, towards electric vehicles. A lot of the OEMs had put targets that to by a certain year this percentage of our cars will be electric. Do you think that's going to continue, or do you think that's going to change given where we are, right? And again, there's several tensions here. On the one hand, as we head into a recession, or perhaps already in a recession, people have less money to replace current cars they own with electric vehicles, which by nature are more expensive. On the other hand, I think what COVID has exposed is perhaps that we are much more susceptible to what happens in nature and climate change and a lot of the things that are happening as a result of our impact on the environment, right? So kind of where do you sit and where do you land on what's going to happen in the world of moving towards electrification, towards electric vehicles? Is that going to accelerate, or do you think that's going to slow down?
This is very important. If the car has become a part of essential because of safety, because of socialization, this medium of socialization, drive-ins. I was very happy to see those numbers in the previous survey, in the previous presentation. Yeah, drive-ins. Like if I need socialize, if I need car to socialize, if I need car to go out, work, do stuff, travel, have a summer vacation, then I will consider car as an essential. That means like if it's in my essential, then I will put some money on it. Two ways I can put money on it. Either I might buy a new car because I want to own. I was using Uber and everything, but I want to own right now. Or I might extend the life of the car that I have, right? So I might have a good maintenance. I might extend the life of the car. So the electric, definitely there will be more car ownership. The technology that is required for self-driving cars and electric cars is dependent on other technologies, especially self-driving car, right? In electric car, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the enough electricity grid, electric energy grid? So it's dependent on other technologies. So depending on the part of the nation, we will see penetration and further adoption of electric cars maybe, but also it's very much dependent on these other technologies. Electric car, what I am really fearing is this couple of decades we have trained the consumers about making sustainable choices. But the fear, the elevated fear might make consumers unlearn or put those sustainability concerns to aside when making these type of decisions, especially coupled with the recession and the ambiguity about the economic conditions, might make sustainability as a secondary motivator, and that is scary. Not only in car, everywhere, like single-use products, all these plastic cups and everything. So sustainability might take a different hit from this. We will see.
Yeah, interesting. And in the same vein, just trying to get granular when it relates to autos and OEMs. You talked a lot about early on, the inside versus the outside of people being comfortable in their car, being safe. Do you think there's going to be a movement towards larger vehicles, right? So we know kind of prior to COVID, there's been a shift, towards trucks and SUVs, and some OEMs have been stopped manufacturing sedans, right? On the other hand, of course, they are expensive. They are gas guzzling, which is challenging in a time when we might be going into recession. What's your, as a futurist, what's your kind of view on the types of cars that people are going to buy? Is there going to be a shift in that, or what is that going to look like in the next 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah. So I was already seeing that car turning into this safe place. There's a conflict between psychology and sociology about what is a space, what's the place, so I use both of them. So turning into the space and place. McDonald's was trying to understand how it can turn the self-driving car into a dining space. Everybody is trying to capitalize on the freed up hands and freed up time that people will have in a self-driving car. So what can we do in a dining space, right? Like if car becomes a dining space. Disney was trying to turn the car into an entertainment space. They had projects with Audi. They were producing some VR, AR, and mixed reality solutions that will be used in the car that uses the actual street and layer them with virtual and augmented layers. And if Sephora is smart, or if any car company is smart enough to go to Sephora, if people don't feel private at home, especially with these enforced socialization during the pandemic, can car be a me time space? So when you have these, then you think about the design of the car differently. If I'm going into a dine-in theater or dine-in concert, a drive-in concert, drive-in theater, then where will I put the popcorn? Or where will I put the, I will be like, we will not be able to see each other. Car wasn't a social place. Now if we're going to the concert together, then at least I might want to turn the seat a little so that we see each other rather than seeing each other's back. I'm just giving an example. This can be, when you think about the space as an entertaining socialization type of spaces, then you think about the design differently. Right? So can there be some ways to feel the concert? Can there be some multimodality experiences, brand experiences like haptic feedback that can connect me more with the experience?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, Bahis, is you're quite bullish on the car market going forward, and you're thinking there's going to be a lot of people spending more time in cars. They're going to want larger cars as an extension of their living space, and they're going to be using their cars for a lot more things besides just transportation.
More time means more space. If I spend more time if I go on a vacation, it means more space. But the car experience will not be single modality, will not be only whatever there. It will be layered. It will be connected with your smart home. It will be connected with the smart city in the future. So it will be part of a system that gives you a different understanding of experience. So car will be part of this experience. You will say, Alexa, prepare me for my travel to, I don't know, New York. It comes to me. I always use New York, but New York is not an option right now. To Grand Canyon. So so car, Alexa will talk to your car and like makes the car part of that system so that they talk to each other. So the meaning of car change as the meaning of home changes, meaning of work changes, meaning of experience changes.
Very cool. I think it's fantastic to have an optimistic point of view, especially in these days when it comes to the auto industry, because I know sometimes there's a little bit gloom and doom in the current dialogue, but it's great to hear. I think we have brighter days ahead, which is fantastic, and I'm looking forward to doing all of those things in my car. Of course, not things that I had when I was a kid growing up in Orange County and driving to my first job at Disneyland. So perhaps looking forward to how that will evolve.
That's also very important. That's also very important. These dystopian, utopian narratives are important. Right? Why are we feeling the ups and downs? Because the market is that way. The narratives, the myth market in the marketplace or how this problem is talked to us is basically the dystopian and utopian narratives, right? There's the dystopia of like there's no vaccine, we will all die, the death, the unemployment, this ambiguity, this fear. On the other hand, the climate is doing better. We needed to slow down. We needed to have time to ourselves. So this is very much how things, the narratives are working right now. Dystopian, utopian narratives are working together as a friction on the top of each other.
Fantastic. It's a good thing to look forward to, Bahis. And thank you for your time. And
thank you.
Can't wait to see how things develop.
Thank you.
Over to you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great discussion. And you heard Bahis talking a little bit in the beginning there about habits and rituals. In our own research, we show that while people are longing for their old habits and routines, they've also spent some time trying new things during this time and trying some new habits, new routines around health and around transportation and around exercise and eating and cleaning and all those things. So we want to take a little bit of time and talk a little more deeply about new habits and old habits and how habits stick. And for that, we are going to turn to Namaka Sagara, who is the president of the Ipsos Behavioral Science Center, where she helps clients understand why people do the things they do. She's also a visiting research scholar at Duke University. Namaka, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. So if you don't mind showing the slide. So as Matt mentioned, so I will be discussing about using Ipsos habits framework, how to understand and how to predict future behaviors. But first, I'd like to talk about two kind of two key premises for this session. One is something that we've been discussing for a long time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically pre-COVID-19, our life was filled with the status quo. We had rituals, we had habits, we have this behaviors that we do so often and are comfortable, and it's almost automatic. But with COVID-19, there's a sequences of disruptive moments. Now we have to change our behaviors, stay home, not going to commute to work, we work from home, probably doing more online delivery than we used to. Another key premise for this session is that before behavioral science became popular in the industry, some of the key idea is that desire leads to behavior. Well, desire is definitely important part of making the behaviors to happen, but that's not enough. That's what behavioral sciences teaches us. Not just the desire, but also something that triggers that behavior is extremely important. So we call it cues or triggers in the session. So let me go to the next slide. I forgot that I can actually change the slide, which is great. Okay, perfect. So let me introduce you this habits framework. So habit framework consists of 3 key components. The first one is cue and behavior and reward. And even though this is a habits framework, I'm actually going to discuss something that we might not call it exactly habit, but something that we probably feel comfortable doing because we've done it before, such as road trips. I'm going to use, summer is coming up, and I'm going to use road trip to kind of walk you through. But this framework can be applied to many, many different type of behavior to have just a deeper understanding. So let's think about the cues, right? Cues is basically something that trigger bad behaviors to happen. There's a different type of cues. For example, one cue could be psychological cues, right? Like you've just been kind of feeling bored, just staying at home. Kids might be just feeling bored, looking for something exciting to do, something fun to do. So that could be a psychological cues. Or it could be the physical cues. You're just feeling kind of physically empty, like you just need to get out of the house and do something else. Or it could be the identity. It could be your identity as caregiver, for example. Feel like it's time for, creating some good memory for kids. It's been a tough time. I want to do something fun for the kids. And of course, it could be context. It could be time of the year. It's the spring just has passed, and now summer's coming. Well, summer is, for a lot of people, it's a fun road trip type. So that thought itself could be a trigger. But trigger, of course, isn't enough. In order for behaviors to happen, we need to make sure that there isn't any barriers for stopping those behaviors to happen. Again, there's a multiple component of behavioral barriers. One obviously might be financial barriers. That's something that I think a lot of us are struggling and definitely paying close attention to. Another one is this kind of the emotional barrier. Even if you have a thought of going to do a road trip, it's possible that you feel a little scared, you feel anxious, you feel just kind of uncertain how that might work out. Another is physical accessibility or the ability to actually engage in the behaviors, such as, are the places you want to go open? Are the theme park open? Are the museums open? Also, another barrier is knowledge barrier. Do you know, how do you find out if those places are open? Are the beaches open? Are the park that you want to go open? The restaurant open? And how do you make that happen? Is there any protocol you need to fill out? Is there any pass you need to buy? There's a lot of new knowledge that you need to acquire. Another thing is effort, or oftentimes it's a perceived effort, the amount of effort you think it takes to make it happen, which is oftentimes correlated with the knowledge. The micro knowledge usually correlated with higher perceived effort. But let's imagine that you're able to actually go on a road trip and think about the different rewards, right? Because in order for this behavior to become more or less habitual, maybe not the daily habitual, but maybe a new habitual behavior, you need to have some kind of positive feedback. So it could be, one obvious one is the functional reward, just getting the road trip done. It could be the emotional reward, having fun with your friends and family, the people that you visited. Also, it could be the social rewards, being able to spend time with your friends and relatives. Also, it could be cognitive reward. It could be very engaged in planning a trip, actually going to museums, learning history of the town. That could be very cognitively engaging. Another is sensory, right? Like just getting out of the house, feeling that fresh air, opening your the car window down, feeling that air, that could be positive sensory reward. Unfortunately, the reward is not always positive. Sometimes rewards could be negative. The functional negative reward. Well, negative reward, you can kind of think of it as sort of negative consequences. It's possible that the road trip simply just didn't work. The negative emotional reward is that you are just end up being anxious the whole time. The social aspect is, one thing that's really interesting is sort of the emergence of new social norms. What does it mean for you and your family to take a trip right now? Is there any kind of violation of social norm? Cognitive negative consequence could be something like it was just simply too exhausting mentally. So that could be a negative cognitive reward. So these are the different type of positive and negative rewards. I just walk you through cues and behavior rewards. In terms of cues, there's a functional, physical, psychological, and a contextual cues that make behavior likely to happen. And also behavior barriers, some of the things that you want to pay attention to is financial, emotional, and ability and accessibility to those resources, and knowledge and perceived effort. And we also talk about functional, emotional, social, cognitive, and sensory rewards. So if you have any targeted behavior, that could be the usage of the car for road trip, or it could be adopting a new electric vehicles, or it could be using their own cars for commute or public transportation, whatever the behavior may be. You can break it down in terms of cues. What trigger those thoughts and behaviors? What are the potential barriers? And what is the potential positive and negative reward? And that way you can kind of start to see where the frictions are. Because sometimes it's the lack of cues that not make the behavior happen, right? Of course, the behavior with more cues or more strong cues or embedded cues, as well as the behavior that has the least amount, less intense barriers for the behaviors to happen. And of course, the more positive rewards you have and less negative rewards you have, that behavior is likely to happen. And you can do the similar exercise for sort of the competitive behavior, basically the alternate option that you might have. So in terms of road trip, if somebody don't actually do road trip, what are the other options? It could be just simply staying home. What are the behavior barriers for simply staying home? What is the negative and positive reward of simply staying home? Or it could be maybe taking a little camping trip to a nearby park or even in the backyard. What are the cues and behavior barriers and positive and negative rewards? Once you lay that out, you kind of start to get a sense of which behavior is more likely to happen, and then which behavior is more likely to become habitual and ritual. So I hope this habits framework gives you some sense of how to break down the behavior and then use that insight to be able to predict if those behaviors are likely to happen. Now, thinking over to you.
Thank you so much. And I can think of all kinds of negative rewards about staying home at the moment as a father of 3 little kids. I am really looking forward to being able to get on the road once we can do so safely and sanely. But thank you very much for that. If Namaka, Bahis, and Oscar want to flip off their cameras, we're going to make the rest of the cameras bigger so you can see our panel a little bit as we're talking. And I will introduce them and we will get rolling. With our panel today, we have Alex Selkover, who's a CMO and product marketing executive. He's an award-winning author and writer and co-author of The Driver in the Driverless Car. Fans of the WTF will recognize him from our 2018 issue about the future of mobility. Also joining us is Aaron Wren, aka the Urbanophile. He's a well-respected urban theorist, columnist for Governing Magazine, and former contributing editor at City Journal. But his background is in consulting, and he is a former partner at Accenture. And finally, John Kaiser is an SVP in the Ipsos U.S. Automotive and Mobility Group, where he works with clients on mobility and transportation innovation. He'll talk about the findings from our syndicated Global Navigator study about AVs, EVs, and the impacts of COVID-19. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And I should just set a little bit of context, since we're going to be talking about urban planning issues, among other things, that Aaron is a former Chicagoan and New Yorker currently living in Indianapolis. John and Alex are both in the greater Bay Area, and I am coming to you from the one suburb left of Chicago in Oak Park, but I am a born and bred Detroiter, so go Tigers. I'm going to start with Aaron. Again, we kind of like to try and take this big picture in the WTF. So I want to start by talking about the impacts of COVID on our changing lifestyles. And Aaron, how do you think this will kind of change our urban and suburban landscape?
Yeah, I think we first have to start by dividing the country into basically 2 different groups of places. There are the large, dense, mostly coastal cities, also including Chicago, plus, say, some college towns that are what I call multimodal land. These are the places where kind of multimodal transportation as a reality. Then most of the rest of the country, say 90% of America, is car country. I mean, the automobile is totally dominant in those places. And you could put New York City kind of in a category by itself. And if you look at the real urban booms in America, most of them have occurred in this multimodal land. They've occurred in the New Yorks, in the Chicagos, where there's been unbelievable growth in the central area. There has been some of that in smaller cities, but not nearly at the same scale. So essentially, I think how this thing plays out is going to depend on which part of the country you're in. The multimodal land, which is really maybe 15 to 20% of the country, gets most of the attention primarily because that's where all the media people are based. But the rest of the country, I think, is where most of the people live. So in kind of car country, car use basically has nowhere to go but down. And I think most of the interesting dynamics might be in this kind of multimodal land, where we see this urban, this kind of urban population boom that had been happening kind of fizzle a little bit as people are afraid to use public transit, particularly in places like New York. I think we had already seen that urban population growth had essentially peaked in the first half of the 2010s and was in decline anyway. So I do look for some of those places that have been much more dependent on non-automobile transportation to potentially redistribute a little bit how people get around and how they live, somewhat more towards cars perhaps, but also towards bicycling, micromobility, walking, other forms of transit as well. But I definitely think the big point is you need to think of it in kind of essentially two different groups of places in America because not every place is the same.
Yeah, and Alex, I know you have some thoughts on the micromobility angle, and how do you think that will also impact the way we're investing in both AVs and EVs? You're muted, Mr. Alex.
How about now? Is that better?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, forgive me. Anyway, I basically agree with what Aaron's saying, that we essentially have two countries in terms of mobility. In the multimodal areas, micromobility, I think, is going to be absolutely on fire. And I've witnessed this in San Francisco and New York. More and more people are more comfortable doing things like riding electric scooters, which, you know, if you asked people 5 years ago if an executive would ride a scooter to work, they would say no way. Today, lots of them are doing it. And I think COVID actually drives that to a certain degree because more and more people will feel safer being up on the surface streets in control of their environment rather than being stuck on the F train, you know, jammed cheek to jowl with 6,000 other people on the way up 2nd Avenue in the morning. And I don't think that this is going to go away after COVID. I think once people get a taste for micromobility, it will really drive strong adoption. What's been really impressive to me as well around this is that in cities like Oakland, you see micromobility adoption up and down the income chain. So it's not just the sort of the millennials or the tech workers. You see lots of people using it. You know, students use it to get to school. You see teachers or folks that are delivery workers. Lots of people have adopted it. And I think that when you look at AV in cities, I think that that's actually the next step up from micromobility because as you remove more cars from the city streets, which I think is going to happen in the not-so-distant future, then autonomous vehicles become a lot more viable because the environments are less confusing and, frankly, there are fewer humans to gum up the works in the drive behind the wheel of the car.
Yeah, and John, what are you seeing in the Navigator data about, again, this kind of autonomous electric vehicle future? It feels like that's what all the conversation was about 2 years ago, and now all the conversation's about, oh my God, are we even going to drive cars?
Well, but I think it's, as we talked and shared by both Aaron and Alex, I agree, it's this split of the two worlds, right? This idea of urban versus suburban. But I think what's going to happen is you're going to see communication integration with that, because in order to get to the urban, you need the automotive vehicle. But then once you get to the urban environment, that's where you get into the opportunity using some of the micromobility last mile efforts. And we're also seeing, and I know it wasn't really touched on, this idea of the infrastructure. The streets are going to be closed and going to be widening, and they're going to be greater utilization, causing consumers to be willing and wanting to try it because it's safer for them to do it and it's going to be convenient. But this idea of autonomous and electrification, we're seeing from the consumer data and preferences, they're open to it. They like this idea of what it can do for them, this advancements in the technology from the electrification, and this idea of, what do you call it, self-driving or autonomous, or even, prior to that, this idea of, advanced features that enable detection of pedestrians, hypothetically, right? This idea that we're going to have more pedestrians integrated into our city streets, as well as with cyclists and scooters. This idea is detecting them. How do we, get through that safely? And this idea of this transition going from, I guess, semi-autonomous to full autonomous, some of those adaptive features can be advantageous and helpful in that transition to ensure a safe environment to be traveling, ultimately.
One thing I wanted to note, I'm sorry, Matt, one thing I wanted to note as well, I think just which relates to what Aaron had said, and then I'll see. I think that the media has gotten it really wrong on autonomous vehicle adoption. I think that they've kind of, and a lot of the car companies, they focused on, we're going to figure out how to make it work in New York City. And that's where old people have focused on, the cars won't work because they can't drive in these environments. Those are the hardest environments, period. But in places like Indianapolis or places where it's more spread out, it's a lot easier for autonomous vehicles to work. So I actually think adoption will happen faster in those parts of the country, and it will work, and it will be really great.
Yeah, I think that's probably why Waymo is doing a lot of their testing in Chandler, Arizona.
Yeah, exactly.
I know when I was thinking of where I should live, one of the big considerations for me and my family was that we have a variety of options. So I live in a walkable suburb. We walk our kids to school. We can walk to restaurants. We can walk to, grocery stores and convenience stores and drug stores and all those things. But I also have two different forms of public transportation, and I live right off a highway, and I live between two major airports. So we have two cars. I commute via train when I commute via train, which Lord knows when I will do that again. But I think we're starting to see a little bit of that accelerating in this time, that we're having street closures, we're having walking-only areas. Do we think that's going to kind of change both our urban landscape, but also we'll see more of that porting into the suburbs? It will have more options and more choices, still with a car dependency probably, but with a variety of things to wrap around that.
Yeah, again, I think in this, what I label car country, car usage has nowhere to go but down. And we've really seen like all these suburbs in America are trying to build much more biking infrastructure, biking trails. They're focusing on building up their town centers so that there are walkable areas within the town. One of the things I know that's popular around here in one suburban farmer's market is hundreds of people bicycle to the farmer's market. So everybody still owns a car. Everybody still probably drives to work, but not every single trip is being made on a car. You're seeing much more usage of bicycling. Micromobility is also becoming popular in many of these, more spread out cities because it's where maybe attractions are just too far away to comfortably walk it every time you want to do it, but hopping on a scooter to go a mile or 2 miles really makes it kind of a game changer versus getting your car. So I think there's definitely going to be a lot of shift, kind of on the margin in a lot of these places, probably not as much towards public transit, but towards some telecommuting, because I think it seems likely that remote work from home will increase somewhat, in bicycling and micromobility and other means.
Yeah, we see some hints in some of our data that you bring up public transportation, that public transportation is going to be hit hardest probably of all of these things, that crowding into the subway is going to be hard. However, there are still a lot of people who are reliant on that, especially in our bigger cities. But in our data, we also see that the people who do not currently own a vehicle but are suddenly more interested in owning a vehicle are probably a lot of those public transportation riders. They're younger, they're people of color, they're people of lower income. So how do we see that balance shifting, that as people in a lot of ways lose public transportation as a viable option, are they going to have to buy more cars? Are they going to have to, unfortunately, deal with public transportation anyway? Like, how do we see that all balance shifting? I'll start with Alex on that one.
So I think that actually taps to a certain degree into the micromobility question, because I mean, what I'm seeing, I think Aaron had talked about this as well too, is not just bikes but electric bikes, which are kind of the intermediate step between scooters, and they're running. You know, you can have an electric bike that runs 25 miles an hour very comfortably, which for the vast majority of car trips gets you there fractionally less quickly, and has benefits around parking. You also see more and more people everywhere across the country willing to use Uber or willing to use car-for-hire platforms for longer haul trips, or it's much easier to rent cars than it used to be. You have Zipcar, you have all these other services. So I think that in terms of them purchasing cars outright, I think that will come as sort of a final step. But for a lot of them, things like electric bikes or using rideshare services, they'll start to do that more. Now, I think in terms of what it means for public transit, I think it's really, really going to hurt public transit in a lot of ways because, you know, those are the same people that probably don't want to ride the subway anymore after COVID or don't want to ride the buses anymore. And a lot of the cities have done themselves no favors, and I won't say it's just the cities, but you know, because some of it was federal funding, state funding, by really allowing those transit systems to become very decrepit. I mean, you look at like the New York subway system, and you compare it to other subway systems around the country, and not around the country, around the world, and it's astonishing how little money has gone into that system over the years, even though it's like one of the highest density systems ever. So that's how I kind of see this playing out, and I'll finish on like one anecdote. In San Francisco, at least, it was remarkable to me how when Uber came in and then subsequently some of the micromobility companies, how this opened up entire swaths of the city that may have been 4 or 5 miles away from the city center and were essentially unserved by public transit. I mean, you could take a bus or take a Muni, but it was really impossible. It was an hour-and-a-half ride to go 4 miles. The service was irregular. It was unpleasant. You know, now whole swaths of the city, people are now willing to live there where they couldn't before anymore. And so I see that kind of impacting lots of the urban areas around us.
Yeah, I talked in the intro a little bit about fundamentally how we are a car culture. And John, as we think about how that role of the car, and I use the term liberally, I mean, obviously all sorts of mobility options play in our lives. How do you see that kind of transitioning from, you know, does it become a little more utilitarian as we use this to get from place to place and possibly with autonomous drivers or whatever, you know, all these things. But also as Bahis was talking about, you know, and as we were talking about in our data and a little bit in Mike's presentation as well, as the car becomes a little more of an extension of the way we live our lives and the things we do and we're driving through things and to things and getting deliveries. How do you see that all kind of changing the role of the car in our lives fundamentally?
Well, actually, that's a good segue. The one thing I could see is while we saw some of our data in earlier presentations, overall miles will be less because perhaps you're not commuting as much, you're not using it for those trips, but you're using it for a variety of occasions, whether you're using a drive-through services, going to a drive-in, or just going out. Like this is what was the word? It's like a way to get out but stay inside, right? Because you're inside the safety of your vehicle, but it's just a way to explore. So I do see this idea of more uses, more importance in the vehicle because of those more uses. And we were talking this idea of, okay, as the urban, the younger, perhaps those that don't own before, they're going to perhaps put more of their budget to this vehicle because it's creating more outlets of, I don't know if to call it entertainment, use, because now you're able to do more things with it. instead of just this idea of commuting, perhaps, right, or just going to Costco and back. I know that's very popular in the suburbs. I do live in the suburbs at the San Francisco area, and I, of course, do that. But this idea of just getting out, right, just going for a drive, cruising, if you will, those kinds of things, it creates more use cases, creates this idea, and I know you also touched on, okay, how does this impact the auto industry? What types of amenities should they have included? What kind of vehicle segments are going to be interested? And that's this idea of multi-function proposition. You want it to have a comfortable. You want this idea of, you know, a little bit of spaciousness, a variety of use cases inside the vehicle. You, of course, want plenty of charging ports. Things like that was touched on in an earlier presentation. So I see it being multifaceted and causing people to be, I guess, putting a priority on having a vehicle as part of their budget, ultimately, because of there's going to be less willingness to do public transportation. But I wholeheartedly agree with the increase in the micromobility, and as those choices increase, it's going to cause people to want to use them because it's convenient. Instead of dealing with parking or dealing with some of those, you know, that's just not fun. That's where I could see, you know, adapting and utilizing those, you know, alternative solutions, whether it's e-bikes or e-scooters or what have you. But we'll see. We are definitely going to see some change, and it's going to continue. And I think that stuff will stick ultimately.
Yeah, Matt, this kind of reminds me of like, well, okay, email was going to replace phones. Not entirely. Text was going to replace emails. Nope, Slack was going to. I mean, they all kind of build on each other. I don't think anything goes away in the future. I think that that's all still here. And to John's point, people do, and what you know, Hans was saying, people do view their cars as a safe environment. So I think car sharing, I mean, meaning their willingness to purchase a fractional part of a car, I think that's going to be a really tough sell. I think they're either willing to Uber or they want to own, but I don't see much in between.
Although I did just see a piece today that the New York Police Department and Ford have already created a software upgrade that the police officers, after they take a suspect out of the back seat, punch a bunch of weird codes into their cruise control, and the car will heat up to 133 degrees for 15 minutes
awesome.
and disinfect itself. And they've already released that update in cruisers today. So I could see that rolling into the Uber and Lyft fleets as well, that you get in and your vehicle has been sanitized from the last rider.
Yeah, that's cool.
Interesting. Well, that's good.
One thing that John mentioned, this idea of just using a car to take a drive. You know, we've been reading a lot about the return of the pleasure cruise. As people have, the one thing you can do when you're, supposed to be social distancing and everything shut down is take a drive. It a little bit goes back to one of the psychological representations of the car from a generation or two ago, is that a car is freedom. That especially for young people, for teenagers, is the baby boom generation. The car was a symbol of their freedom. It gave them autonomy, the ability to get out. I probably a transitional generation, but I've always kind of viewed the car a fairly utilitarian device, and maybe it's seen that way even more by younger generations. But increasingly, what you're seeing in this time is people seeing that the car is freedom from being cooped up at home. We can drive, and we can just drive out in the country. And we've even been doing that, just taking drives out in the country. And I wonder if that will stick in people's minds, that there will be much more of a re-identification of the car with this, with freedom, in a sense, just as Dr. Alon talked about it, essentially the car is a refuge, as well as some of the psychological elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, we actually were doing kind of the opposite. We would throw all the kids in the minivan and take them downtown because downtown was unusually empty. So one day we threw a bunch of bikes in the back and we used them bike shares for the adults, and we just biked around downtown because there was no traffic. It was amazing. But we're also seeing in our data that people are thinking more about road trips, and they're thinking more about rural and scenic destinations so that they are a little more isolated. They are out of the density of the big cities. We are at 3:20 Eastern, Detroit time. So I want to give each of you kind of 2 minutes for closing thoughts. Then I will wrap up and we can end a couple minutes early. John, you first.
All right. Now, the one thing that I would take away from this is, as we go forward, is we just have to look at these new use cases as new behaviors for the auto industry and how that vehicle could be utilized, whether it's cruising, whether it's using it for just a drive-in experience, right? Thinking about those and expanding the horizon of what should be available in that vehicle. And I know from earlier presentations that was important, but this idea of the car is still important. It's gaining importance, even though less miles will be driven. So I just really want that takeaway. I do take a bullish and optimistic view, is that I do believe cars will remain and will be even more important to a broader set of consumers in the U.S. market.
Aaron, you next.
Yeah, I would just caution everybody, we all love to prognosticate the future, but COVID
That's why we're here.
The truth, I think we need to be aware, too, that we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. And so I would always have us be aware that we should keep monitoring the data going forward and see how it evolves over time. Because sometimes what we think might happen is exactly the opposite that ends up happening. I keep going back to 9/11 and thinking, after 9/11, people would have said, New York, it's over for New York. People are going to consider too much terrorism risk. And the decade after 9/11 turned out to be better for New York than the decade before it. And so we can't necessarily know in advance what's going to happen. I think that's why we need to just be constantly monitoring the data going forward and dynamically adjusting, which of course is tough to do in a long lead cycle industry like the automobile industry. But it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Absolutely. Alex?
So I think one thing we didn't talk about, which I think will be crucial, is price, actually. And I see really strong price pressures and innovation pressures being placed on the industry by the rapid growth of markets outside of the U.S. where people cannot pay $25,000 for a car. And just like we have seen in so many other technology industries, when bottom of the pyramid innovation flows upwards, it tends to benefit everybody who's buying. So I think a lot of things, you will see much higher quality cars coming out for lower money. And I think that we'll start to see this creation of these intermediate tiers. And I think that will be accelerated by decreases in price of electric vehicles or the battery packs, essentially. Because like once you remove the internal combustion engine from the equation, then making cars cheaper can be much easier than you're just strapping wheels onto a battery. Now it may sound nutty right now, but I think that the batteries will probably be heavily subsidized by multiple governments, the production of it, and I think that the prices are going to come down faster and faster. So I think that combination will actually mean we'll have a whole lot more people with cars, but the cars will be a lot more accessible to many more people.
Yeah, I mean, taking the kind of the global perspective, that's a good point to end on, that things that are here are not necessarily everywhere and vice versa. And yeah, as we've talked throughout this, it's going to affect different people differently and in different ways. So I think this has been a really great discussion. I thank you all for joining us. I would like to thank actually all of our speakers as we kind of close out the day here in What the Future Land. We've had a great lineup today. I would like to give an extra special thanks to, from our side, Ellen Alexoff, Frank Forkin, and Lara Wolf, who helped organize this great day's worth of programming and bring it all to us. This is kind of a first for us here, especially doing this virtually. So if you have feedback, please reach out to all of your Ipsos contacts. We would love to hear what you think. And thanks for coming and bringing us all these perspectives from all around the world. We'll send you a follow-up link with a recording of today's events in case you missed anything or want to review. And you can find the WTF itself with contributions from all of our WTF speakers and more at future.ipsos.com. Our transportation issue will be posted this week. We'll have a lot of feedback from the speakers you've seen here today, as well as some more. And really, I just want to end a little bit early. I know that in the future of transportation, there's a big story happening this afternoon. So we will dismiss you early so you can go and watch the live streams and the coverage of the amazing SpaceX liftoff as we have our first U.S. astronauts leaving American soil since 2011. It's a big day for private adventures in space. So Thank you again all for joining us. It's been great. We've really enjoyed having you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.